My name is Cassidy Vance, and for 28 years I had believed in a world where hard work, dedication, and an unyielding spirit could carve out any destiny. I was a scientist, or at least I was on the precipice of becoming one. Fresh out of Northwestern University with a shiny new PhD. In neurobiology, my head was brimming with the intricate dance of neurons and the endless possibilities of medical innovation. My thesis, a groundbreaking study on neural regeneration, had not only earned me top honors but also a coveted position at GenNexus Labs in San Diego. It was a dream job, a chance to contribute to something bigger than myself, to make a real difference in the lives of those suffering from debilitating neurological conditions. My flight was booked for next Tuesday, a one-way ticket out of Harmony Creek, Ohio, and into a future I had meticulously built for myself. Harmony Creek was the kind of town where ambition often wilted under the weight of familiarity, where gossip traveled faster than the morning paper, and where leaving felt like a betrayal to some unspoken community pact. But I had always known I was meant for more than the quiet hum of its small-town life. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, had always expressed pride in my academic achievements, or so I thought. They would tell anyone who would listen about their brilliant daughter, the one who was going to cure diseases. Yet beneath their beaming smiles, I often sensed an undercurrent of something else, a subtle, clinging, a possessiveness that felt at odds with their outward support. My younger brother Ethan was 10 years old, a gap of 18 years between us that had shaped our relationship profoundly. He was my moon and my stars, the innocent heart of our often complicated family dynamic. When I was a teenager, he was a toddler, and I often took on a pseudo-parental role, changing his diapers, reading him stories, and teaching him his ABCs. He had a laugh that could chase away any shadow, and eyes that held the boundless curiosity of a child. But Ethan also carried a heavy burden, one that had silently woven itself into the fabric of our lives since he was 5. He suffered from a mysterious neurological condition that doctors in Harmony Creek could only vaguely diagnose, a progressive illness that manifested in severe motor function impairment. For the past 5 years, his life had been a series of wheelchairs, physical therapy, and the slow, agonizing loss of independent movement. Yet despite his physical struggles, his spirit remained unbroken, a tiny flame flickering defiantly against the encroaching darkness. He loved my science stories, his small face lighting up when I described the wonders of the human brain, telling me that one day I would make him walk again. That promise, unspoken but deeply felt, fueled much of my research. The day my world shattered began like any other Friday. I was in my childhood bedroom, meticulously packing boxes, each item a tangible link to my past, now carefully being folded into my future. The air buzzed with a nervous excitement, a thrilling anticipation for the life that awaited me. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the quiet house, followed by a series of frantic thuds. It was Eleanor's voice, laced with raw terror. My heart leaped into my throat. I dropped the book I was holding and sprinted down the stairs, my feet barely touching the worn carpet. I found them in the living room, a scene that would forever be seared into my memory. Ethan was on the floor, convulsing violently, his small body jerking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide and unfocused, rolling back into his head, and a thin line of foam bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Richard was on the phone, his face ashen, yelling into the receiver for an ambulance. Eleanor was on her knees beside Ethan, weeping hysterically, stroking his forehead and calling his name, though he was clearly beyond hearing her. The next few hours were a blur of flashing lights, frantic voices, and the sterile smell of the local hospital. Dr. Miller, our family physician, a kind but often overwhelmed man, delivered the grim news. He told us Ethan's condition had dramatically worsened, that his body was no longer responding to the few medications they had tried, and that his seizures were now more frequent and severe. He explained that Ethan needed a specialized medication, an experimental drug only available through a specific clinic in Germany, which was astronomically expensive and not covered by insurance. He added that there might be a chance for a revolutionary high-risk surgery overseas, but it would require an even greater financial commitment, far beyond anything our insurance could touch. As Dr. Miller left the room, leaving us alone in the stark white confines, Richard and Eleanor collapsed into each other's arms, their cries echoing in the silence. Eleanor turned to me, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen, a raw plea etched onto her face. She said to me, her voice hoarse with despair, that I was Ethan's only hope. She reminded me of my intelligence, my understanding of complex medical science, telling me that I was the only one who truly understood Ethan's condition, the only one who could navigate this nightmare. She insisted that they, her, and Richard were simply too old, too overwhelmed, too unequipped to handle such a monumental challenge alone. Richard, his face buried in his hands, only mumbled his agreement, saying he felt useless, that all his efforts to provide for the family weren't enough. Eleanor then looked me straight in the eye and declared that my scientific research could wait, but Ethan's life could not. She painted a vivid picture of a future without Ethan, a life devoid of his laughter, his innocence, his very presence. She appealed to every ounce of my love for my brother, to every memory of us together, to the unspoken promise I had made to him. She made it clear that if I left, I would be abandoning him, leaving him to a fate she implied would be far worse than his current suffering. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the air. If you leave, Ethan might die and it will be your fault. The words hit me like a physical blow. My carefully constructed future, the one I had fought so hard for, suddenly seemed selfish, trivial, almost cruel in the face of my brother's precarious life. How could I pursue a career in neurological research, hoping to save countless strangers, when my own flesh and blood, my precious Ethan, was staring death in the face right here, right now? The thought of leaving him, of not being there during his darkest hour, was unbearable. It felt like tearing a part of my own soul away. I tried to reason with them to find an alternative. I suggested that perhaps I could delay my start date at GenNexus, find a way to work remotely, or even contribute financially from California. I said that my new salary would be substantial, that I could send money home, that I could still help. But Eleanor shook her head vigorously. She explained that remote work wouldn't be enough, that Ethan needed constant hands-on care 24/7. She said that they couldn't provide that anymore, that her back was giving out, that Richard was working long hours, barely making ends meet. She reiterated that the specialized medication and potential surgery required an immediate, substantial upfront payment, not just monthly contributions, and that my savings, my PhD bonus, were our only immediate recourse. She argued that only my scientific mind, my understanding of complex medical jargon, and my meticulous nature could manage the intricate network of international clinics, specialists, and pharmaceutical companies involved in Ethan's case. She made it sound like a full-time job, a mission only I was qualified to undertake. Richard, looking utterly defeated, added that he felt like a failure as a father, unable to protect his youngest child. He told me that he had always dreamed of a better life for us, that he never wanted to burden me, but that this was different. He insisted that this was a matter of life and death, and that family had to come first above all else. He stressed that this wasn't just about money, but about having all hands on deck, a united front against this terrible disease. Their pleas, their tears, their absolute desperation chipped away at my resolve piece by painful piece. I looked at Ethan, lying so fragile in the hospital bed, his breathing shallow, his face pale. His small hand, which I held in mine, felt cold and lifeless. My mind flashed back to countless memories, teaching him to ride his first bike, even though his legs were already weakening. Him laughing as I chased him around the yard. His proud smile when he showed me a drawing he had made. The thought of losing him, of not fighting for every single breath he took, was a torment I couldn't bear. My scientific dreams, the groundbreaking research, the prestigious lab, all of it seemed secondary, distant, almost frivolous in comparison to the raw, visceral need to protect my little brother. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the sterile hospital air burning my lungs. I told them, my voice barely a whisper, that I would stay. I would give up my job, I would use my savings, and I would dedicate myself to Ethan's care. Eleanor let out a sob of relief and pulled me into a fierce embrace, whispering her gratitude, telling me I was the best daughter a mother could ask for, a true angel. Richard nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek, simply saying, "Thank you, Cassidy. You've saved us all." Their relief was palpable, a heavy weight lifting from their shoulders, settling squarely onto mine. The next few days were a blur of cancellations. I called GenNexus Labs, my voice thick, with unshed tears, explaining the family emergency that made it impossible for me to accept their offer. The hiring manager expressed genuine sympathy, saying they understood, but the position couldn't be held indefinitely. A dream carefully nurtured for years evaporated with a single phone call. I emptied my savings account, a substantial sum of over $20,000 money I had meticulously put aside for my first apartment, my new life. It was all earmarked for Ethan's experimental medication and the initial consultations for his overseas surgery. My new life began immediately. The vibrant hues of my future faded into the muted tones of our old house in Harmony Creek. My days became a relentless cycle of caregiving. Ethan's condition, as described by Dr. Miller and reiterated by my parents, seemed to demand constant vigilance. I learned to administer his medications, a collection of unmarked bottles and syringes Eleanor provided, always insisting they were too sensitive for the local pharmacy to handle. I bathed him, fed him, pureed meals, changed his diapers, and painstakingly turned his frail body every few hours to prevent bedsores. His room, once filled with toys and childish laughter, became a sterile sick room, dominated by medical equipment I had purchased with my remaining bonus money. Richard and Eleanor, true to their word, were often busy. Richard claimed he was working extra shifts at the construction company to cover the mounting bills. Eleanor would say she was researching alternative treatments or meeting with support groups in neighboring towns. They would leave early in the morning, sometimes not returning until late at night, leaving me alone with Ethan. They would return looking tired, sometimes irritated, but always quick to express their gratitude for my sacrifices, praising my unwavering devotion. I tried to keep up with my scientific literature, clinging to the remnants of my academic life, hoping to find answers for Ethan's deteriorating condition. But exhaustion was a constant companion. Nights were restless, filled with the slightest whimpers from Ethan or the need to administer his next dose of medication. Days were physically and emotionally draining. My hands, once accustomed to pipettes and petri dishes, were now rough from lifting, cleaning, and caring for a bedridden child. 2 years bled into 3, then 4, and by the time I was 33, the lines on my face told a story of sacrifice and isolation. My reflection in the mirror showed not the vibrant young scientist I once was, but a weary woman with hollow eyes and a constant pallor. The ambitious drive that once defined me had been replaced by a quiet, desperate resignation. Yet despite the overwhelming drudgery, a tiny flicker of unease began to stir within me. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a discordant note in an otherwise monotonous symphony. Ethan, for all his incapacitation, sometimes held my gaze with an intensity that seemed almost too profound for a child described as severely compromised. There were moments, fleeting but unsettling, when I would catch his eyes, and instead of the usual vacant stare, I would see a flash of something else. Fear. Or perhaps an appeal. He couldn't speak, only communicate through rudimentary gestures and pained sounds, but sometimes when our parents weren't around, his attempts at gesturing seemed more deliberate, more desperate. It was as if he was trying to tell me something he couldn't vocalize. I also couldn't shake the feeling that my parents' financial struggles didn't quite add up. While I was meticulously tracking every penny of my depleted savings and the meager income from my part-time clinic job, they seemed to have an endless supply for themselves. New clothes would appear for Eleanor, always in fashionable styles from boutiques in the next city over. Richard would occasionally boast about a new golf club or a lucky win at the local poker game. They would go out for date nights at the only upscale restaurant in Harmony Creek, always returning late, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and celebratory wine, while I remained at home tethered to Ethan's bedside. When I gently inquired about these expenses, Eleanor would dismissively say that a little treat keeps us sane, darling, and that your father works so hard he deserves it. Richard would simply grunt, claiming it was found money or a small bonus for a big job. The explanations always felt hollow, like carefully constructed facades. My attempts to understand Ethan's medical records were also consistently thwarted. Whenever I tried to access his official files from Dr. Miller's office, my parents would intervene. Eleanor would insist that she had all the necessary paperwork at home and that there was no need for me to bother the clinic staff. Richard would firmly tell me that I didn't need to worry about the details, saying, "You focus on the day-to-day care, Cassidy. We'll handle the paperwork." They would assure me that everything was under control, that they were doing everything they could to find a cure. Their resistance, however, only fueled my quiet apprehension. Why the secrecy? Why the deflection? The most disturbing realization came with the medications Eleanor supplied. I was a scientist. I understood pharmacology. Yet these bottles had no pharmacy labels, no dosage instructions from a doctor, no clear indication of their chemical composition. When I asked Eleanor about them, she would claim they were special compounds from the German clinic delivered discreetly. She would say that the clinic didn't want their proprietary formulas widely known, and that the local pharmacies wouldn't understand how to handle them. I knew it sounded suspicious, but in my exhaustion and blinded by my love for Ethan, I dismissed it as an eccentricity of international experimental medicine. My world had shrunk to the four walls of our house, the constant demands of caregiving and the unsettling questions that began to prick at the edges of my consciousness. I was trapped, a ghost in my own home, haunted by the specter of a future I had willingly abandoned. But as the quiet unease grew, a seed of something else began to sprout alongside it. A nascent, desperate need for answers. I still believed in the goodness of my parents, but the cracks in their narrative were becoming too wide to ignore. The weight of my promise to Ethan, the one that bound me to this life of sacrifice, was slowly, imperceptibly shifting. It was no longer just a promise of care. It was a promise to understand, to uncover, and perhaps to reclaim. This silent shift marked the beginning of my quiet rebellion, though at the time I was too weary to even name it. I was just a sister trying to save her brother, lost in a labyrinth of my family's making. The quiet hum of the fluorescent light in Ethan's room was the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. It was past midnight, and a fresh wave of that gnawing unease had settled over me, heavier than usual. I had just finished administering Ethan's night medication, a clear, odorless liquid Eleanor swore was crucial for his stability. As I gently lowered his arm, his fingers, frail and thin, instinctively wrapped around mine, a faint tremor running through them. His eyes, usually half-lidded and distant at this hour, were open, fixed on me. And for a split second, I saw it again, that flicker. Not of pain, not of resignation, but of something akin to fear, a desperate, silent plea hidden deep within their cloudy depths. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, vacant stare, but it lingered in my mind, a phantom touch. I pulled my hand away, a chill creeping up my spine, and went to sit by the window. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the backyard, illuminating the forgotten swing set where Ethan and I used to spend hours, his delighted giggles echoing through the summer air. I remembered teaching him how to pump his legs, his small body straining with effort, his face flushed with joy as he soared higher and higher. He would shout to me, asking if I was watching, and I always was, my heart swelling with pride at his boundless energy. Now that same body lay still, confined, a prisoner in its own skin. The juxtaposition was too stark, too painful. My mind raced, connecting disparate observations that I had until now dismissed as stress or exhaustion. The vague diagnoses from Dr. Miller, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable during our brief encounters. The unbranded medications delivered with such secrecy. My parents' unexplained absences, their sudden bursts of new clothes or expensive dinners. And then there was Ethan. If he was truly as compromised as they claimed, how could his gaze hold such complexity, such unspoken emotion? A sharp, almost physical pain lanced through my chest. Had I been so blind, so trusting, so caught up in my own grief and guilt that I had failed to see the cracks in the facade? My scientific mind, trained to observe, to question, to seek evidence, felt like it had been lulled into a deep slumber, overridden by the desperate hope for my brother's recovery and the ingrained loyalty to my family. But the slumber was over. Ethan's eyes, those desperate, pleading eyes, had jolted me awake. The very next morning, the trigger came sharp and undeniable. Richard and Eleanor were downstairs, having one of their private discussions in the kitchen, their voices low but agitated. I was coming down the stairs, careful not to make a sound, when I heard Eleanor's voice, clear as a bell despite her attempts at hushed tones. She was saying something about the payment and making sure Cassidy doesn't find out. My heart hammered against my ribs. Payment for what, and why couldn't I know? A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just vague apprehension anymore. This was concrete suspicion. I waited until they left, mumbling something about errands and meeting with the support group. The moment the front door clicked shut, I began my search. My hands trembled, but my resolve was firm. I wasn't looking for a cure anymore. I was looking for the truth. I started in their bedroom, a space I rarely entered. It felt invasive, violating, but the desperate plea in Ethan's eyes urged me on. And, of 6T, I checked their dresser drawers, under the mattress, inside their closets. Nothing. Only the mundane items of daily life, a few bills, old receipts for groceries, car maintenance. My frustration grew, mingling with a perverse sense of guilt. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was letting my exhaustion and paranoia get the better of me. Then my eyes landed on an old, dusty shoebox tucked away in the back of Richard's side of the closet. It looked innocuous, like a repository for old keepsakes. I pulled it out, my fingers brushing against the faded cardboard. Inside, nestled beneath a few old photographs and a faded newspaper clipping about my high school graduation, was an old flip phone. It was an ancient model, the kind that had been popular years ago, long before smartphones became ubiquitous. It looked like it hadn't been used in ages yet. Something about its presence felt deliberate. Richard always bought the latest gadgets. Why would he keep this relic? My hands were shaking violently now. I pressed the power button. To my surprise, it still had a charge. The screen flickered to life, illuminating a simple menu. I navigated to the messages. And then the world as I knew it imploded. The messages were old, dating back to when Ethan was 5, precisely when his condition had begun. There were hundreds of them, exchanges between Eleanor and Richard, and a few contacts labeled only with initials. The words leaped out at me, each one a dagger to my heart, a poison seeping into my mind. He's fighting me on the chair again. Says his legs hurt from not moving. What do I do? From Eleanor to Richard 5 years ago, tell him we'll have to stop his special medicine if he doesn't cooperate. Remind him Cassidy will be sad if he doesn't get better. From Richard to Eleanor 5 years ago, the doctor bought it. Says it's progressive motor degeneration. Thank God. Now we just need to keep up the charade. From Eleanor to an initialed contact 5 years ago, Cassidy got the Gen Nexus offer. This is our chance. We need to make sure she stays. Ethan needs to have another episode soon. A big one. From Richard to Eleanor 2 years ago, he hates the pureed food. Keeps trying to chew. I have to hold his jaw. This is harder than I thought. From Eleanor to Richard 1 year ago, did you give him the sedative again? He was too active today. Almost pushed off the chair. If Cassidy sees, it's over. From Richard to Eleanor 6 months ago, each message was a brutal blow, dismantling every memory, every sacrifice, every tear I had shed. My breath caught in my throat, a choked sob escaping my lips. It was all a lie. All of it. Ethan wasn't suffering from an uncontrollable, mysterious disease. He was being made to suffer. He was a prisoner, not of his body, but of my parents' monstrous deception. I scrolled through the photos and videos. My hands trembled so violently I almost dropped the phone. There were pictures of Ethan much younger, running around in the backyard, laughing, chasing a ball, completely healthy. Then photos of him looking terrified, eyes wide, being strapped into his wheelchair by my parents. And the videos. Oh, the videos. One video in particular ripped through me like a shrapnel grenade. It was a shaky, low-quality recording clearly taken in Ethan's room. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. He was sitting up in bed, his small legs dangling over the side, looking perfectly capable of moving them. He was pleading, his voice a tiny, desperate whimper, saying, "Mama, Papa, please, I want to play outside. My legs want to run." Richard's face, usually so gentle when he looked at Ethan in front of me, was grim, unyielding. He was leaning over Ethan, his voice a low, menacing growl, telling him that if he didn't stay still, didn't pretend to be sick, then Cassidy would be very sad and they, Richard and Eleanor, would have to go away and leave him. Alone. Eleanor was standing by the door, her expression cold, unforgiving. She had a small bottle in her hand, the same kind of unmarked bottle she gave me for Ethan's medication. She was telling him that if he kept resisting, he wouldn't get his special drink that made him feel better, implying it would make him worse. Ethan had crumpled then, his small shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. He had let himself be lifted back into his bed, his spirit visibly broken. That moment, the image of Ethan's crushed spirit burned itself into my mind. It explained everything. His vacant stares, the occasional flashes of fear, his desperate, subtle attempts to communicate. He wasn't just sick, he was terrified. He was a child forced to perform a horrific charade under threat of abandonment and pain by the very people who were supposed to protect him. My own childhood memories, once cherished, now twisted into grotesque shapes. I remembered countless times I had begged my parents to let Ethan try more aggressive physical therapy, or to consult specialists outside Harmony Creek. They had always dismissed me, saying it was too expensive, too risky, or already covered by his current treatment plan, all the while manipulating me to believe I was his only chance. I remembered their pride in my academic achievements. It wasn't pride in me, but in the asset I represented, the golden goose they could exploit. My scientific dreams, my entire future, hadn't been sacrificed for a noble cause. They had been stolen meticulously and maliciously for their own selfish gain. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of betrayal that threatened to drown me. But beneath it, a new emotion began to simmer, cold and hard and relentless rage. It wasn't the fiery, explosive rage of a child. It was the calculated, simmering fury of a scientist whose most fundamental beliefs had been shattered. My parents hadn't just manipulated me. They had weaponized my love for my brother. They had turned my empathy into a leash, my dedication into a trap. And in doing so, they had not only destroyed my life, but had systematically abused their own child, their innocent son, for years. I clutched the old phone, its cold plastic, a stark contrast to the inferno raging inside me. My hands were steady now, a strange calm settling over me amidst the storm of emotions. The weariness was still there, but it was now infused with a steel-like determination. I had lived in a gilded cage, believing it was a sanctuary. Now I saw the bars, felt their unforgiving chill. My first thought was of Ethan. I rushed back to his room, my heart aching with a fresh wave of guilt. He was still sleeping, his chest rising and falling faintly. I gently stroked his hair, tears blurring my vision. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," I whispered, my voice choked. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner." The innocent child I had promised to protect had been suffering under my very nose, a victim of the people I trusted most. The raw grief for my lost years, for the stolen dreams, for the horrific abuse Ethan had endured, threatened to consume me. I felt the urge to scream, to lash out, to smash something, anything to release the torrent of pain and fury. But then Ethan stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips. His small, innocent face was a stark reminder of why I couldn't afford to break. He needed me. He needed me to be strong, clear-headed, and utterly ruthless. This wasn't just about reclaiming my life. It was about avenging Ethan, about dismantling the elaborate web of lies my parents had spun, and about ensuring they would never ever hurt anyone again. The love I felt for my brother, once a tool for their manipulation, now solidified into an unshakable resolve. I would free him, and I would make them pay. Not just financially, but for every stolen moment, every shattered dream, every tear Ethan had shed in silent terror. The naive, trusting Cassidy Vance was dead. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of betrayal, armed with a scientist's precision and a sister's unwavering fury. The investigation had just begun, and I knew with a terrifying certainty that this was only the first layer of the horrifying truth. The deeper I dug, the darker it would get, and I was ready to face the darkness. The old flip phone still clutched in my hand felt like a burning coal searing through my skin. My mind raced, not in a chaotic panic, but with the cold, calculated precision of a scientist analyzing a complex problem. The emotional devastation was immense, a gaping wound in my soul, but it was overshadowed for now by the urgent need for action. Ethan. He was the priority. I had to free him from this living hell, from the silent torment inflicted by his own parents. The first step was to confirm everything, to gather irrefutable evidence. I carefully went through every message, every photo, every video on that ancient phone, transferring them to my secure cloud storage. I paid particular attention to dates, times, and the specific language used. The special compounds Eleanor had given me to administer the sedatives and muscle relaxants my parents had been giving Ethan to simulate paralysis. The evidence was all there, damning and undeniable. My scientific background, once a source of pride, now became a tool for my cold, righteous fury. I remembered enough about neurobiology and pharmacology to recognize the insidious nature of their deception. They weren't just faking a disease, they were actively causing Ethan's symptoms through chemical means, all while manipulating me into believing I was alleviating his suffering. The pure malice of it twisted my gut. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I meticulously documented everything. I cross-referenced the dates on the phone with my own memories of Ethan's episodes and setbacks. The patterns were horrifyingly consistent. Every time I had expressed a desire to seek outside help, or when a major opportunity for me arose, Ethan would mysteriously worsen, leading to another crisis that tied me more firmly to Harmony Creek. My promotion offer from Gen Nexus directly preceded by the big episode that sealed my fate. The memory of Eleanor's desperate plea, "Cassidy, you're his only hope," now echoed as a cruel, calculated lie. The pain of that realization was a sharp physical ache, but it was quickly subsumed by a fierce determination. I knew I couldn't just confront them. They would deny everything, manipulate and gaslight me until I doubted my own sanity. I had seen their mastery of emotional manipulation firsthand, trapped in its web for years. No, this required precision, stealth, and an iron will. I had to build a case so airtight that they wouldn't have a leg to stand on. The next morning, I feigned illness, telling Eleanor I felt a bit under the weather and needed to rest. This bought me a few precious hours alone with Ethan. My heart ached as I looked at him, so small and vulnerable in his bed. I knelt beside him, taking his hand. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "can you hear me? Can you understand me?" His eyes, still cloudy, seemed to focus for a moment. He made a faint, guttural sound, a sound I had come to associate with his communication attempts. But this time I saw a new urgency in his gaze. "I know, little brother," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I know. It's going to be okay. I'm going to fix this. But I need your help. You have to be strong for me, okay?" I gently squeezed his hand, and to my astonishment, he squeezed back, a faint but definite pressure. A glimmer of hope, fragile yet potent, pierced through the despair. He understood. He was fighting. And now he wasn't alone. That small gesture ignited a fierce fire within me, solidifying my resolve. My first target: the medications. Eleanor kept them locked in a small medical cabinet in the bathroom, always carrying the key. But I was a scientist trained to circumvent obstacles. While Eleanor was out researching, I picked the lock with a bobby pin, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside were dozens of vials, precisely as Eleanor had described. unmarked with generic labels written in her handwriting. I carefully took samples of each, placing them in sterile tubes I had salvaged from an old first aid kit. I also took photos of the cabinet, the vials, and their generic labels. My next stop was Dr. Miller's office. I had to know how deeply he was involved. I knew he was under the Vance's spell, but to what extent? I created a cover story. I was applying for a research grant and needed a comprehensive medical history for Ethan to support the application. The receptionist, accustomed to my devotion to Ethan, was sympathetic. She handed me a stack of papers telling me Dr. Miller was busy but would be happy to review them later. Back home, hidden in my room, I devoured the files. The official diagnoses were indeed vague, a series of possible neurological disorders that conveniently fit the narrative my parents had spun. But then I found something crucial, a series of referral letters supposedly from Dr. Miller to specialists in other states recommending experimental therapies. None of these referrals had ever been discussed with me. They were all for clinics and doctors I had never heard of in obscure locations. And stapled to one of the letters was a faded business card for a private consultation firm in Delaware with a number I recognized. It was one of the initialed contacts on the flip phone. The pieces began to click into place, forming a monstrous mosaic. My parents hadn't just used their money for frivolous things. They had been funneling it to this firm, probably to pay off medical professionals who would corroborate their lies and create a paper trail of fake referrals and experimental treatments. This was a systemic, long-term deception meticulously orchestrated to keep me trapped. The realization was sickening, a new wave of agony, but it was also empowering. I had found the threads. Now I would unravel them. I knew I needed a safe haven, a place where I could continue my investigation without fear of discovery. My childhood friend Sarah Jenkins lived in the next town over a fiercely independent journalist who had moved back home after working for a small city paper. She was the only person I trusted implicitly. I called her, my voice strained, telling her I needed to talk, that it was urgent and life-altering. She heard the tremor in my voice and immediately agreed to meet me at a discreet coffee shop in a neighboring town. The confession was agonizing. I laid out everything: the flip phone, the messages, the videos, the medications, the fake referrals. Sarah listened intently, her face shifting from shock to disbelief to pure outrage. "Cassidy," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "this is beyond horrific. Your own parents, doing this to Ethan, to you." She hugged me then, a tight embrace that for the first time in years felt genuinely comforting. Her support was a lifeline. She didn't question my sanity. She believed me. That belief, that validation, was the first real step in healing the gaping wound in my soul. "We need to get those medications analyzed," Sarah said, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "And we need to find out who this private consultation firm is. This isn't just about family abuse. This is a criminal conspiracy." Sarah, with her network of contacts, found a discreet lab in a major city that could analyze the medications without raising immediate red flags. I packaged the samples carefully, feeling a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the first tangible step in my retribution. The agonizing wait for the lab results felt like an eternity. Each day was a performance, a carefully constructed facade of devoted caregiving while the storm raged within me. I continued to administer the medications to Ethan, my heart heavy with guilt, but knowing that stopping abruptly could raise suspicion from my parents and potentially harm Ethan further. Instead, I carefully reduced the dosage, hoping to minimize their impact. I watched him closely for any signs of discomfort, for any subtle changes. I began to speak to him more softly, reassuring him, telling him that help was coming, that he was loved. And each time I felt that faint squeeze of his hand, a silent communication that fueled my resolve. When the lab results finally came back, they were even more horrifying than I had imagined. The special compounds were a cocktail of potent muscle relaxants and low-dose sedatives designed to induce a state of paralysis and lethargy, mimicking the symptoms of a severe neurological disorder. The long-term use of these drugs on a child would have devastating effects on his developing nervous system, potentially causing real and irreversible damage. The thought of what they had done to Ethan, the deliberate poisoning of his innocent body, sent a wave of nausea through me, coupled with an icy resolve. The pain of it was unbearable, but it was quickly transmuted into a powerful, controlled fury. "They're not just manipulative," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. "They're monsters. They actively harmed him." My next step was to expose the private consultation firm. Sarah, with her expertise, started digging into public records, shell corporations, and medical licensing boards. Within a week, she found it. The firm was a front, a legitimate-looking entity run by a disbarred doctor, Dr. Marcus Thorne, who specialized in creating fraudulent medical records and diagnoses for a hefty fee. He had a history of dubious practices, but his connections and the complexity of his operations made him difficult to catch. He had been providing my parents with the fake reports, the official diagnoses, and the instructions for the medications, all to keep their lucrative charade going. The pain of this new discovery was immense. It wasn't just my parents. There was an entire network involved in this horrific deception. But with each piece of the puzzle, the path to retribution became clearer. My pain began to morph slowly, imperceptibly, into a grim satisfaction. Each successful step in my investigation was a small victory, a chip away at the monolithic betrayal that had defined my life. I knew that a full legal battle would be protracted and emotionally draining. But more importantly, I needed to ensure Ethan's safety and well-being first. I decided to approach Child Protective Services (CPS) and the local police department with all my evidence, starting with Ethan's immediate removal from my parents' care. The day I called CPS was one of the hardest of my life. I had to betray my parents, expose their cruelty to the authorities, and shatter the illusion of our perfect family for the entire town to see. But as I spoke to the CPS worker detailing the evidence, the messages, the lab results, and the horrific videos of Ethan's forced compliance, the weight on my shoulders began to lift little by little. My voice trembled, but my resolve was unwavering. The raw pain of the betrayal was still there, a constant companion, but it was now tempered by a growing sense of empowerment. I was doing this for Ethan. The CPS worker was horrified. She assured me they would act immediately. The local police department, initially skeptical, became grim-faced as I presented the comprehensive dossier of evidence Sarah and I had compiled. The messages, the lab results, Dr. Thorne's criminal history. It was all there, meticulously organized, damning beyond belief. The climax of this initial phase of retribution came swiftly. One Tuesday afternoon, as Eleanor was lecturing me about the importance of family sacrifice and Richard was complaining about rising expenses, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't the mailman. It was two police officers, a CPS, social worker, and an emergency medical team. Eleanor's face, usually so composed, went pale. Richard's jaw dropped. The police officer, a stern-faced woman named Detective Evans, addressed my parents. She said to them that they were there regarding allegations of child abuse and fraud concerning their son, Ethan Vance. Eleanor immediately started to protest, her voice rising in indignation, claiming it was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. Richard blustered, demanding to know who had called them, accusing them of harassment. Then Detective Evans turned to me. She asked if I was Cassidy Vance and if I had any information to share. I met my parents' stunned gazes, their eyes wide with confusion and then dawning horror. Eleanor's face contorted a mixture of rage and terror. Richard's eyes narrowed, a silent threat passing between us. But I no longer cared. The agony I had carried for years, the guilt, the helplessness began to recede, replaced by a cold, searing satisfaction. "Yes, Detective," I said, my voice clear and steady, devoid of any emotional tremor. "I do. I have everything you need to know." I watched as their carefully constructed world began to crumble around them. The police moved to secure Ethan, the social worker explaining the process in a calm, professional tone. Eleanor screamed, lunging towards me, her face a mask of furious betrayal, but the officers held her back. Richard, for the first time, looked truly broken, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a defeated slump. As the paramedics carefully prepared Ethan for transport to a real medical facility, I knelt beside his bed, taking his small hand in mine once more. This time his squeeze was stronger, more deliberate. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not fear but a flicker of understanding, a spark of hope. And in that moment, despite the raw, aching wound in my heart, a profound sense of relief washed over me, chilling and exhilarating all at once. The first phase of my mission was complete. Ethan was safe. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of my own self, returning a nascent sense of justice, being served a quiet, cold satisfaction blooming in the ruins of my past. My pain wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was receding, making way for a potent, unwavering resolve. The hunt had begun. The echoing silence in the house was a hollow drumbeat against my ears, each pulse a stark reminder of the wreckage that had been my life. Richard and Eleanor were gone, whisked away by the law, their final indignant shouts of betrayal and misunderstanding replaced by the cold, empty air. Ethan, my precious Ethan, was finally in the hands of real medical professionals, his long, painful charade brought to an abrupt end. The immediate aftermath was a maelstrom of raw emotion, searing grief for the lost years, a profound shame for my own blindness, and an aching tenderness for Ethan's stolen childhood. But beneath the chaos, a core of unyielding steel had formed within me. The trusting, naive Cassidy Vance was dead. In her place was a strategist, a meticulously calculated force ready to unleash a vengeance as precise and devastating as a surgeon's scalpel. Sarah, my rock, arrived moments after the last police cruiser disappeared down the street. She found me in the living room, a space now stripped of its false pretense of warmth, feeling like a stranger in my own home. My eyes were dry, fixed on the spot where Ethan's specialized yet fraudulent wheelchair usually sat. She said to me, her voice soft but firm, that I was an absolute warrior, and asked if I was all right, truly all right. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that anchored me to the present. I turned to her, the weariness in my bones battling the sharp new clarity in my mind. I told her that all right was a concept that no longer applied to me. I explained that I was a scientist trained to dismantle complex problems, and that my parents had presented me with the most intricate and horrifying problem of my life. I then stated that they had believed their carefully constructed illusion was impenetrable, that my love for Ethan was their ultimate weapon. I asserted that they had gravely underestimated the power of a shattered heart, especially one that also held a rigorously analytical mind. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. She said she understood and asked what was next. Her journalistic mind, always gravitating towards action, was exactly what I needed. My plan began to unfold, not in a flurry of rash decisions, but with the methodical precision of a research protocol. This wasn't just about justice. It was about ensuring every facet of their lives, every pillar of their deceit, crumbled to dust. The immediate priority was Ethan's safety and future. The state medical facility, the New Hope Neuro-Rehabilitation Center, located 2 hours north of Harmony Creek, was a beacon of genuine hope. I spent the first few days there meticulously reviewing his actual medical records, consulting with the new team of specialists. They confirmed what I had learned from the flip phone. Ethan had a rare but treatable form of motor neuron disease, exacerbated by the sedatives and muscle relaxants he had been given. His prognosis for regaining mobility and speech, while challenging, was cautiously optimistic. He wasn't paralyzed. He had been chemically incapacitated and psychologically conditioned. The sheer monstrosity of it rekindled the cold fire of my resolve. I immediately applied for temporary guardianship of Ethan. My lawyer, the pro bono contact Sarah had found, expedited the process, presenting the overwhelming evidence of parental abuse and neglect. The court quickly granted my request, stripping Richard and Eleanor of any legal rights over their son. This was the first concrete victory, a visceral wrenching of power from their grasp. The sense of profound relief I felt knowing Ethan was truly safe was immense, a balm to the deepest wounds of my soul. It didn't erase the pain, but it began to fill the void with a sense of purpose. Richard and Eleanor had thrived on public perception. They were the suffering saints of Harmony Creek, drawing sympathy and even financial aid from the community under false pretenses. This carefully constructed image was their most valuable asset, and I intended to burn it to the ground. Harmony Creek is a small pond, I explained to Sarah during a late-night call from the rehabilitation center. Everyone knows everyone. Gossip travels fast. It's time we give them a story they'll never forget, one that paints my parents not as victims but as the villains they truly are. Sarah, with her keen understanding of media, introduced me to Mark Jensen, the investigative reporter from the Harmony Creek Gazette. I didn't hold back. I laid out every sickening detail: the forced paralysis, the fake medications, the manipulation of my career, the systematic abuse of Ethan. I provided him with copies of the text, the lab results, and Ethan's new accurate medical reports from New Hope. I even shared excerpts from the videos of Ethan pleading with them, edited carefully to protect Ethan's dignity while still conveying the horror. Jensen was aghast. He told me, his voice tight with controlled anger, that this wasn't just a local story. It was a national one, a horrifying exposé of betrayal and cruelty. He promised to break it wider than just the local paper, offering it to larger regional news outlets as well. The story hit the stands and the internet like a meteor. Harmony Creek parents charged with child abuse and fraud. Daughter alleges years of deception, forced paralysis of youngest son. The headline screamed, accompanied by a picture of a young hopeful Cassidy from my PhD graduation, juxtaposed with a recent weary photo of me, a stark visual of the life that had been stolen. The article meticulously detailed the charges, my testimony, the lab results, and the involvement of the disbarred Dr. Thorne. It was an unsparing, meticulously researched account that left no room for doubt. The reaction was immediate and seismic. My phone, which had once been a prison cell, now buzzed with calls and messages of outrage and support from friends, former professors, and even strangers from Harmony Creek. The initial shock turned to anger, then to disgust. Richard and Eleanor, once the recipients of sympathetic glances and hushed whispers of pity, became pariahs. Their church, the pillar of their social life, issued a formal statement condemning their actions. Their names, once spoken with reverence for their supposed suffering, were now whispered with contempt. The pure, raw satisfaction of seeing their world unravel piece by excruciating piece was intoxicating. Each damning headline, each scornful comment was a small but potent antidote to the years of silent suffering. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but it was now overshadowed by the icy triumph of witnessing their carefully constructed reputations implode. Their reputation was shattered, but that wasn't enough. They had stolen my future, my financial independence, and years of my earning potential. It was time to systematically dismantle their financial standing, to leave them with nothing but the consequences of their greed. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Henderson, worked with me on the civil lawsuit. We meticulously calculated every penny my $20,000 PhD, the bonus which had vanished into their Ethan's medical expenses fund. My lost wages from Genexus Labs, estimated at over $150,000 annually for 5 years, a staggering sum. The thousands I had spent on their fake medications and medical equipment, and most significantly a substantial sum for emotional distress and the severe psychological trauma inflicted upon both Ethan and myself. The total figure was staggering, designed to leave them utterly destitute. "We're going for everything they own, Cassidy," Miss Henderson stated, her voice grim. "Their house, their retirement accounts, their cars. Every last dime they've extorted or defrauded will be accounted for." The civil suit was filed concurrently with the criminal charges. The district attorney, Miss Davies, was also pursuing charges for grand theft, medical fraud, and conspiracy, arguing that my parents had actively defrauded me, a vulnerable young adult, of my financial resources under false pretenses. The intersection of the criminal and civil cases created a legal pincer movement that left my parents no escape. I provided Miss Davies with every bank statement, every receipt, every documented payment I had made over the past 5 years. I also produced evidence of their own frivolous spending, the new clothes, the expensive dinners, the found money that consistently appeared despite their claims of financial hardship. Their elaborate web of lies, once so convincing, now unraveled under the harsh light of forensic accounting. The pain of reliving those financial decisions, of seeing how easily I had been manipulated into sacrificing my hard-earned money, was immense. Each line item on the spreadsheet was a fresh wound. But with each submission of evidence, with each calculated move to seize their assets, that pain was slowly, powerfully transmuted into a potent sense of vindication. Their financial stability, which they had built on the ruins of my life, was now being systematically dismantled by my own hand. It was a cold, satisfying burn. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the puppet master behind the medical fraud, was not to be spared. His role in enabling the abuse and providing the fraudulent medical reports was critical to my parents' scheme. I ensured that all the evidence linking him to the Vance family's deception was robustly presented to both the state medical board and the district attorney's office. The medical board, upon reviewing the irrefutable evidence, the fake diagnoses, the consultation firm records the lab analysis of the medications that directly implicated his prescribed compounds, swiftly and permanently revoked Dr. Thorne's medical license. This effectively ended his ability to practice medicine in any capacity, shutting down his illicit operations. Miss Davies' office, armed with the same evidence, also filed criminal charges against Dr. Thorne for medical fraud, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and reckless endangerment. The public outrage fueled by the Harmony Creek story ensured that his case would be pursued aggressively. The satisfaction of knowing that another piece of their carefully constructed conspiracy was being systematically dismantled, and that a truly unscrupulous individual would face justice, was a profound and empowering feeling. It was not just about my parents. It was about ensuring that no other family would suffer at the hands of such a callous system. Amidst the legal battles and public fallout, my focus remained steadfast on my healing and, more importantly, on Ethan's Lashen's 25. The specialists at New Hope were phenomenal. Ethan was responding remarkably to proper medication and intensive physical therapy. Slowly, painstakingly, he was regaining control of his limbs. His voice, once a whispered, guttural sound, was becoming clearer, stronger. During one of my visits, as he was painstakingly relearning to use a spoon, he looked up at me, his eyes now bright with a newfound clarity devoid of the fear that had once clouded them. He said to me, his voice still a little soft but undeniably present, that he wanted to walk again. He wanted to run with me like before. He said he remembered. A fresh wave of tears, but this time tears of pure joy and profound relief, streamed down my face. I knelt beside his bed, holding his hand, feeling the strength in his grip, a stark contrast to the frail fingers I had cradled for years. I told him that we would run together. I promised him that his past did not define his future and that together we would build a new one. This was the core of my retribution, the most potent form of justice. Seeing Ethan reclaim his body, his voice, his very childhood, was a more profound satisfaction than any punitive measure I could inflict upon my parents. Their pain, their ruin, was a necessary consequence, but Ethan's freedom was the ultimate triumph. Each small step he took, each clear word he spoke, chipped away at the deep-seated pain within my own soul, replacing it with a quiet yet fierce joy. The emotional scars would remain a testament to the battle I had fought, but they no longer defined me. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, a protector, and an architect of justice. The plan was working, not just in ruining their lives, but in rebuilding ours brick by painful, exhilarating brick. The Harmony Creek community, once so quick to judge and condemn, now watched the drama unfold with a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine remorse. Many approached me awkwardly, expressing their apologies for not seeing the truth, for being fooled by my parents' facade. I accepted their apologies with a quiet dignity, knowing that true understanding would only come with time. I made a point of attending the local church service the Sunday after the criminal charges were announced. Richard and Eleanor had been prominent members, always sitting in the front pew embodying piety. Now their seats were empty. As the pastor delivered his sermon filled with vague platitudes about forgiveness, I stood up during the sharing of peace moment. My voice, clear and steady, resonated through the hushed church. I told them that I was Cassidy Vance and that many of them knew my story, or at least parts of it. I explained that I wanted to say that forgiveness was a journey, and that for true healing there had to be accountability. I said that true peace was not achieved by ignoring injustice, but by confronting it and by protecting the most vulnerable among us. I looked directly at the empty pew where my parents used to sit, and then at the faces of the congregation, many of whom averted their gaze. I concluded by saying that Ethan, my brother, was now safe and beginning his long path to recovery. I told them that he deserved a life free from deception and abuse, a life where he could run and play and speak his truth. I said that as a community they had a responsibility to foster such an environment, to look beyond surface appearances and to question when something felt wrong. As I sat back down, a ripple of murmurs spread through the church. Some nodded, some looked uncomfortable, but none openly challenged me. It was a subtle act of defiance, a public reassertion of my narrative, a way to reclaim the story of my family from the clutches of their lies. The satisfaction was profound, a quiet victory in the long war for my own truth. The pain was still a deep current beneath the surface, but the feeling of being heard, of being believed, and of seeing justice slowly unfold was a powerful antidote. The plans for retribution were in motion, and each step brought a profound, if melancholic, sense of liberation. My parents' world was disintegrating, and I, the daughter they had chained, was the one holding the hammer. The full force of the legal and public reckoning crashed down upon Richard and Eleanor Vance with an almost poetic savagery. They had built their lives on lies, on a carefully crafted narrative of misfortune and sacrifice, and now that narrative was being systematically shredded piece by agonizing piece. The satisfaction I felt watching their world crumble was not born of malice, but of a cold, clear justice. It was a satisfaction hard-won, forged in the fires of betrayal and years of stolen life. Their initial encounter with the system was one of sheer disbelief. I heard snippets of their reaction through Sarah, who had sources within the courthouse and the jail. Richard, I was told, had raged, accusing the police of being manipulated by a vengeful daughter and claiming that I was mentally unstable. Eleanor, ever the performer, had wept dramatically, painting herself as a heartbroken mother unjustly persecuted. They believed their performance, honed over years in Harmony Creek, would still work. They believed the authorities would see through my lies and recognize their supposed devotion. They were wrong. The weight of the evidence was simply too heavy, too meticulously gathered, too irrefutable. The lab reports detailing the sedatives and muscle relaxants in Ethan's system, the expert medical testimony from the specialists at New Hope Neurorehabilitation Center, confirming his actual treatable condition, and most damningly, the messages and videos from that old flip phone. It all painted a picture of calculated cruelty that even their most practiced dramatics could not obscure. The criminal trial began 6 months after their arrest. I sat in the courtroom, a witness, a victim, and an architect of their downfall. Richard and Eleanor, looking considerably older and much less polished than I remembered, sat at the defense table, their expressions oscillating between defiant indignation and thinly veiled fear. The public gallery was packed, a morbid curiosity drawing Harmony Creek residents to witness the spectacular implosion of their once respected neighbors. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with a strange sense of calm. The years of emotional turmoil, the sleepless nights, the raw agony of discovery, it all coalesced into a laser-focused clarity. I recounted everything, my voice steady, devoid of the tremors that had once plagued my private moments. I spoke of my scientific dreams, the coveted position at GenX's labs, and how I had willingly sacrificed it all for Ethan. I described the meticulous care I had given him, the agonizing helplessness I had felt believing I was fighting a losing battle against a devastating disease. Then I detailed the discovery of the flip phone, the crushing weight of the truth, the systematic deception, and the chilling realization that my own parents had poisoned their youngest son and enslaved their eldest daughter. I described the unbranded medications Eleanor had given me, the instructions for dosage, and the lab results proving they were a deliberate cocktail of incapacitating drugs. I looked directly at Richard and Eleanor, their faces slowly draining of color with each precise, unflinching word. They tried to interrupt, to protest, but the judge silenced them with a gavel. The prosecuting attorney, Miss Davies, then played excerpts from the videos on the old flip phone. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Ethan's small, pleading voice filled the air, begging his parents to let him run his small legs dangling, clearly capable of movement. The sight of Richard's menacing face, his whispered threats to Ethan about me leaving if he didn't comply, and Eleanor's cold, unyielding expression as she held the sedative bottle sent an audible gasp through the gallery. Richard buried his face in his hands. Eleanor's body stiffened, her eyes wide, with a horror that was no longer feigned but born of seeing her own monstrous actions reflected back at her, undeniable and raw. The full, devastating truth of what they had done, stripped bare for all the world to see, was finally registering on their faces. It was a harrowing sight, and I felt a surge of cold, hard satisfaction. The pain of the past was still a fresh wound, but witnessing their utter collapse was a potent balm, a sign that the scales of justice were slowly, irrevocably tipping. The most profound impact came with Ethan's indirect testimony. The New Hope specialists presented his current progress videos of him undergoing intensive physical therapy, slowly but surely regaining control of his limbs, his speech improving with each session. They presented expert testimony about the long-term effects of the drugs he had been given, confirming the deliberate, prolonged incapacitation. Then Miss Davies played a video taken just days before the trial of Ethan, now standing with the aid of a walker, his voice still soft but clear, stating, "I want to run with Cassidy again." They made me pretend. The collective gasp in the courtroom was palpable. Richard and Eleanor, who had until then maintained a fragile composure, buckled. Richard openly wept, his body shaking uncontrollably. Eleanor let out a choked cry, a sound of utter devastation, no longer performing, just breaking. Their world, their carefully constructed lie, was not just exposed, it was annihilated. That moment, seeing them finally truly understand the depth of their depravity and its consequences, was a bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. The profound agony of Ethan's suffering was still heavy in my heart, but their abject despair was a powerful vindication. The jury's verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts: child abuse, medical fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. As the words guilty echoed through the courtroom repeatedly, Richard slumped in his chair, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. Eleanor stared straight ahead, her eyes vacant, fixed on nothing, a ghostly pallor replacing her usual flushed indignation. They were silent, utterly, terrifyingly silent. The performance was over. The game was lost. Their world had imploded, and the sound it made was not a roar but a deafening internal implosion. I felt a surge of bittersweet triumph. The pain of their betrayal was a scar that would always remain, but the sight of their complete, irreversible downfall was a powerful validation of my fight. The sentencing hearing followed a few weeks later. The judge, clearly moved by Ethan's case and the methodical cruelty of the parents, handed down severe sentences. Richard and Eleanor Vance were sentenced to decades in state prison, with no possibility of parole for a significant portion of their terms. Dr. Marcus Thorne, facing similar charges, received an equally harsh sentence, his career and freedom irrevocably lost. As they were led away in handcuffs, their faces were pale, their movements stiff and unresponsive, as if the life had been drained from them. There were no more protests, no more dramatic tears. only a stunned, defeated silence. The civil trial, though less dramatic, was equally devastating for them. Miss Henderson methodically presented the evidence of financial fraud: my PhD, bonus my lost wages, the cost of Ethan's real medical care versus the fake expenses. The judge, swayed by the criminal conviction and the mountain of financial records, ruled overwhelmingly in my favor. Richard and Eleanor were ordered to pay restitution for every penny they had taken from me, along with substantial damages for emotional distress and lost income. Their house, their cars, their retirement accounts, every asset they possessed was liquidated. The house in Harmony Creek, the very stage of their insidious play, was foreclosed upon and sold. Their carefully accumulated wealth, built on my sacrifice and Ethan's suffering, was stripped away, leaving them with nothing. I remembered Eleanor's dismissive words. "Your father works so hard, he deserves it," and Richard's boasts about found money for expensive golf clubs. Now those words were nothing but bitter ashes. The reality of their financial ruin, the absolute desolation of their once comfortable lives, was a chilling spectacle. The satisfaction was not a joyous explosion, but a cold, deep current flowing beneath the surface of my still grieving heart. It was the satisfaction of balance, of seeing the scales righted, however painfully. I never spoke to them again, not directly. There was nothing left to say. The silence they left behind was filled gradually with the sounds of Ethan's progress. His laughter, once a distant memory, now echoed in the hallways of New Hope. His steps, tentative at first, grew steadier each day. Every milestone he achieved, every small victory against the trauma they had inflicted, chipped away at my own enduring pain, replacing it with a quiet, profound hope. Richard and Eleanor Vance were no longer figures of manipulation and control, but shattered remnants of their former selves, confined within the walls of a prison cell, stripped of their public persona, their financial security, and their very freedom. Their silence, once a tool of their power, was now the profound, inescapable echo of their own undoing. They had wanted to control my life, to keep me captive. Instead, their betrayal had unleashed a force they never imagined, a force that had utterly consumed them. And in their dead silence, I found a growing, fragile peace, a testament to the fact that even from the deepest darkness, justice could still emerge, sometimes brought forth by the most unlikely of architects. The pain of the past was etched onto my soul, but their complete, irreversible collapse was a powerful, if grim, step towards my own liberation. The full force of the legal and public reckoning crashed down upon Richard and Eleanor Vance with an almost poetic savagery. They had built their lives on lies, on a carefully crafted narrative of misfortune and sacrifice, and now that narrative was being systematically shredded piece by agonizing piece. The satisfaction I felt watching their world crumble was not born of malice, but of a cold, clear justice. It was a satisfaction hard-won, forged in the fires of betrayal and years of stolen life. Their initial encounter with the system was one of sheer disbelief. I heard snippets of their reaction through Sarah, who had sources within the courthouse and the jail. Richard, I was told, had raged, accusing the police of being manipulated by a vengeful daughter, and claiming that I was mentally unstable. Eleanor, ever the performer, had wept dramatically, painting herself as a heartbroken mother unjustly persecuted. They believed their performance, honed over years in Harmony Creek, would still work. They believed the authorities would see through my lies and recognize their supposed devotion. They were wrong. The weight of the evidence was simply too heavy, too meticulously gathered, too irrefutable. The lab reports detailing the sedatives and muscle relaxants in Ethan's system, the expert medical testimony from the specialists at New Hope Neuro Rehabilitation Center confirming his actual treatable condition, and most damningly, the messages and videos from that old flip phone. It all painted a picture of calculated cruelty that even their most practiced dramatics could not obscure. The criminal trial began 6 months after their arrest. I sat in the courtroom, a witness, a victim, and an architect of their downfall. Richard and Eleanor, looking considerably older and much less polished than I remembered, sat at the defense table, their expressions oscillating between defiant indignation and thinly veiled fear. The public gallery was packed, a morbid curiosity, drawing Harmony Creek residents to witness the spectacular implosion of their once respected neighbors. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with a strange sense of calm. The years of emotional turmoil, the sleepless nights, the raw agony of discovery, it all coalesced into a laser-focused clarity. I recounted everything, my voice steady, devoid of the tremors that had once plagued my private moments. I spoke of my scientific dreams, the coveted position at GenNexus Labs, and how I had willingly sacrificed it all for Ethan. I described the meticulous care I had given him, the agonizing helplessness I had felt believing I was fighting a losing battle against a devastating disease. Then I detailed the discovery of the flip phone, the crushing weight of the truth, the systematic deception, and the chilling realization that my own parents had poisoned their youngest son and enslaved their eldest daughter. I described the unbranded medications Eleanor had given me, the instructions for dosage, and the lab results proving they were a deliberate cocktail of incapacitating drugs. I looked directly at Richard and Eleanor, their faces slowly draining of color with each precise, unflinching word. They tried to interrupt to protest, but the judge silenced them with a gavel. The prosecuting attorney, Miss Davies, then played excerpts from the videos on the old flip phone. The courtroom fell utterly silent as Ethan's small, pleading voice filled the air, begging his parents to let him run, his small legs dangling, clearly capable of movement. The sight of Richard's menacing face, his whispered threats to Ethan about me leaving if he didn't comply, and Eleanor's cold, unyielding expression as she held the sedative bottle sent an audible gasp through the gallery. Richard buried his face in his hands. Eleanor's body stiffened, her eyes wide, with a horror that was no longer feigned but born of seeing her own monstrous actions reflected back at her, undeniable and raw. The full, devastating truth of what they had done, stripped bare for all the world to see, was finally registering on their faces. It was a harrowing sight, and I felt a surge of cold, hard satisfaction. The pain of the past was still a fresh wound, but witnessing their utter collapse was a potent balm, a sign that the scales of justice were slowly, irrevocably tipping. The most profound impact came with Ethan's indirect testimony. The New Hope specialists presented his current progress videos of him undergoing intensive physical therapy, slowly but surely regaining control of his limbs, his speech improving with each session. They presented expert testimony about the long-term effects of the drugs he had been given, confirming the deliberate, prolonged incapacitation. Then Miss Davies played a video taken just days before the trial of Ethan, now standing with the aid of a walker, his voice still soft but clear, stating, "I want to run with Cassidy again. They made me pretend." The collective gasp in the courtroom was palpable. Richard and Eleanor, who had until then maintained a fragile composure, buckled. Richard openly wept, his body shaking uncontrollably. Eleanor let out a choked cry, a sound of utter devastation, no longer performing, just breaking. Their world, their carefully constructed lie, was not just exposed, it was annihilated. That moment, seeing them finally truly understand the depth of their depravity and its consequences, was a bitter victory, but a victory nonetheless. The profound agony of Ethan's suffering was still heavy in my heart, but their abject despair was a powerful vindication. The jury's verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts: child abuse, medical fraud, conspiracy, and reckless endangerment. As the words "guilty" echoed through the courtroom repeatedly, Richard slumped in his chair, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. Eleanor stared straight ahead, her eyes vacant, fixed on nothing, a ghostly pallor replacing her usual flushed indignation. They were silent, utterly, terrifyingly silent. The performance was over. The game was lost. Their world had imploded, and the sound it made was not a roar but a deafening internal implosion. I felt a surge of bittersweet triumph. The pain of their betrayal was a scar that would always remain, but the sight of their complete, irreversible downfall was a powerful validation of my fight. The sentencing hearing followed a few weeks later. The judge, clearly moved by Ethan's case and the methodical cruelty of the parents, handed down severe sentences. Richard and Eleanor Vance were sentenced to decades in state prison, with no possibility of parole for a significant portion of their terms. Dr. Marcus Thorne, facing similar charges, received an equally harsh sentence, his career and freedom irrevocably lost. As they were led away in handcuffs, their faces were pale, their movements stiff and unresponsive, as if the life had been drained from them. There were no more protests, no more dramatic tears, only a stunned, defeated silence. The civil trial, though less dramatic, was equally devastating for them. Miss Henderson methodically presented the evidence of financial fraud, my PhD, bonus, my lost wages, the cost of Ethan's real medical care versus the fake expenses. The judge, swayed by the criminal conviction and the mountain of financial records, ruled overwhelmingly in my favor. Richard and Eleanor were ordered to pay restitution for every penny they had taken from me, along with substantial damages for emotional distress and lost income. Their house, their cars, their retirement accounts, every asset they possessed was liquidated. The house in Harmony Creek, the very stage of their insidious play, was foreclosed upon and sold. Their carefully accumulated wealth, built on my sacrifice and Ethan's suffering, was stripped away, leaving them with nothing. I remembered Eleanor's dismissive words, "Your father works so hard, he deserves it," and Richard's boasts about found money for expensive golf clubs. Now those words were nothing but bitter ashes. The reality of their financial ruin, the absolute desolation of their once comfortable lives, was a chilling spectacle. The satisfaction was not a joyous explosion, but a cold, deep current flowing beneath the surface of my still grieving heart. It was the satisfaction of balance, of seeing the scales righted, however painfully. I never spoke to them again, not directly. There was nothing left to say. The silence they left behind was filled gradually with the sounds of Ethan's progress. His laughter, once a distant memory, now echoed in the hallways of New Hope. His steps, tentative at first, grew steadier each day. Every milestone he achieved, every small victory against the trauma they had inflicted, chipped away at my own enduring pain, replacing it with a quiet, profound hope. Richard and Eleanor Vance were no longer figures of manipulation and control, but shattered remnants of their former selves, confined within the walls of a prison cell, stripped of their public persona, their financial security, and their very freedom. Their silence, once a tool of their power, was now the profound, inescapable echo of their own undoing. They had wanted to control my life, to keep me captive. Instead, their betrayal had unleashed a force they never imagined, a force that had utterly consumed them. And in their dead silence, I found a growing, fragile peace, a testament to the fact that even from the deepest darkness, justice could still emerge, sometimes brought forth by the most unlikely of architects. The pain of the past was etched onto my soul, but their complete, irreversible collapse was a powerful, if grim, step towards my own liberation. The silence that descended upon Harmony Creek after the trials was not the suffocating quiet of deception, but a different kind of hush, heavy with the weight of shattered illusions and collective shame. Richard and Eleanor Vance were gone, their names now synonymous with betrayal and cruelty, their once proud home stripped bare and sold to strangers. Dr. Marcus Thorne, the corrupt architect of their medical charade, also vanished into the correctional system, leaving behind a trail of fabricated records and broken trust. The retribution I had sought, meticulously planned and executed, had been achieved. Their public image was destroyed, their financial stability annihilated, and their freedom irrevocably lost. Yet as I stood in the empty shell of my childhood home one last time before the new owners took possession, I realized that true justice was not merely about punishment. It was about what came next, about the arduous, silent work of rebuilding and the profound, often painful lessons learned from the ashes of betrayal. The initial wave of cold satisfaction I had felt witnessing their downfall slowly began to recede, leaving behind an echoing void. It was a strange, disorienting emptiness. For so long, my life had been defined by the pursuit of justice for Ethan and myself, by the unraveling of their monstrous lies. Now that the battle was over, the purpose, intense and all-consuming, that had driven me was gone. I found myself adrift, surrounded by the debris of my past, grappling with the profound question of who I was, stripped of the role of caregiver and avenger. My focus, as always, remained anchored to Ethan. He was my anchor, my reason for enduring. His recovery at the New Hope Neuro Rehabilitation Center was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to his innate resilience and the dedication of truly ethical medical professionals. The sedatives and muscle relaxants had taken a toll, weakening his muscles and slowing his cognitive development, but with the precise medical interventions and intensive therapy, his body began to awaken. I spent countless hours by his side, watching him painstakingly relearn to move his fingers, to lift his arm, to shift his weight. Each small movement, each glimmer of independent action was a quiet triumph, a powerful antidote to the years of his forced stillness. The first time I saw him take a step, his small hand clutching a parallel bar, his face contorted with effort but alight with determination, I wept. These were not tears of pain or anger, but of overwhelming joy and profound relief. He was reclaiming his body, his childhood, his very essence, one faltering step at a time. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about him, eventually walking independently, perhaps even running, though the full extent of recovery from the chemical effects would be a long journey. His speech too blossomed. His soft, hesitant words grew clearer, more confident. He spoke of his memories, the fear of being left alone if he moved, the painful stillness, the terror of his parents' anger. He remembered their threats, their insistence that Cassidy will be sad if he didn't pretend to be sick. Listening to his innocent recounting of their abuse was agonizing, a fresh wave of grief for his stolen years, but it was also a vital part of his healing and mine. He was speaking his truth, and in doing so, he was beginning to mend. For my own part, the psychological scars ran deep. The betrayal by my parents wasn't just an act. It was a systemic dismantling of my fundamental trust in the world, in the very people who were supposed to be my protectors. I sought therapy, a decision prompted by Sarah's gentle insistence. Dr. Ramirez, a kind and insightful therapist at New Hope, helped me navigate the labyrinth of my emotions. We explored the concept of parentification, how I had been forced into an adult role burdened with responsibilities far beyond my years, even before Ethan's illness. My parents' manipulation had preyed on my innate sense of responsibility, my deep love for my brother and my scientific drive twisting them into chains. Dr. Ramirez helped me understand that my parents' actions stemmed from a twisted, desperate insecurity. They hadn't wanted me to leave Harmony Creek not because they loved me selflessly, but because they feared being alone, unequipped to cope with life's challenges and their own financial inadequacies. Their devotion to Ethan was a calculated performance, a means to control me and to extract sympathy and resources from the community. It wasn't love. It was a desperate, self-serving act of emotional parasitism. This understanding, though painful, brought a strange kind of clarity, allowing me to detach from the personal sting of their betrayal and view it with a more objective, almost clinical lens. They were not just malicious. They were deeply broken, consumed by their own fears and an inability to face reality. This was not an excuse, but an explanation that helped me to finally begin the process of letting go of the profound personal offense. The lessons I learned from this agonizing journey were etched into my very soul. The most profound was the insidious nature of familial control and the vital importance of boundaries. I had once believed that love meant boundless sacrifice, that family came above all else, no questions asked. Now I understood that true love was built on respect, honesty, and mutual autonomy. Love without boundaries was not love. It was a cage. I learned that my self-worth was not defined by my sacrifices for others, nor by my ability to fix problems, but by my inherent value as an individual with my own dreams, my own needs, and my own right to a life free from manipulation. The years I spent in servitude had instilled in me a hyper-vigilance, a deep-seated fear of being taken advantage of, which Dr. Ramirez helped me address. It was a slow process of learning to trust again, to allow vulnerability without fearing exploitation. Sarah remained a constant, unwavering presence. She wasn't just a friend. She was the sister. I chose the one who saw through the charade when I couldn't, the one who championed my fight. Together we explored what a chosen family truly meant, a network of support built on genuine connection and respect rather than biological ties. This chosen family became my sanctuary, my anchor in a world that had once felt so precarious. My career, once a shattered dream, slowly began to re-emerge. The scientific curiosity that had always defined me was still alive, albeit transformed. The experience with Ethan had given me a unique, visceral understanding of neurological trauma and recovery. I eventually accepted a research position at a smaller, more ethical lab affiliated with New Hope Neuro Rehabilitation Center. My focus shifted from theoretical neurobiology to the practical application of rehabilitation science, directly contributing to the recovery of patients like Ethan. It wasn't the prestigious Gen Nexus labs, but it was fulfilling, purposeful, and deeply meaningful. I was using my knowledge to heal, not to be exploited. Years passed. The house in Harmony Creek, a symbol of my lost youth and Ethan's suffering, became a distant memory, replaced by a new home near New Hope, a place filled with Ethan's laughter and the quiet hum of my renewed research. Ethan, now a teenager, walked with a slight limp, but he walked. He spoke fluently, his voice sometimes carrying a trace of the fear he had endured, but filled with the boundless curiosity of a boy who had been given a second chance at life. He loved school, excelled in art, and often spoke of his desire to become a veterinarian. He was thriving. I saw him not as a burden, but as a living testament to resilience, a constant reminder of the profound power of truth and freedom. I never visited Richard and Eleanor in prison. There was no need. Their fate was sealed, their punishment served not just by the legal system, but by the utter desolation of their own making. I had confronted the truth, exposed the betrayal, and rebuilt my life and Ethan's from the ground up. Their silence was the only communication I needed, a profound, chilling echo of their absolute undoing. The painful lessons of betrayal had been hard-won, but they had forged in me an unshakable understanding of genuine connection. True family was not determined by blood, but by unwavering trust, unconditional support, and an abiding respect for each other's autonomy. It was about standing up for truth even when it shattered your world and finding the courage to rebuild. The scars remained deep and indelible, a part of my story. But they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of the darkness I had faced and the light I had found in reclaiming my voice, my future, and the precious life of my little brother. The property that had truly changed hands was not just money or power. It was the recognition of my inherent worth, a right no one could ever take from me again.